Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Brandy Shunk. I'm with Homeschoolers of Maine. I am on staff with the Communications Department. I am also a regional representative for Washington and Hancock counties. And I am joined today by Kathi Carney. Kathi, thank you so much for being here with us.
Great to be here.
Yeah, awesome. She's been a part of our home board for many years. And Kathi, we're very grateful for your service for Homeschoolers of Maine. Kathi has also worked with homeschooling families in Maine for more than 43 years. She's helped author the Maine Homeschool Law, and she is a teacher of gifted and talented students. She consults with families of gifted children across the country and around the world. Again, thank you so much for your time to be here, and we'll just kind of catch everyone up a little bit. This is the second of a video series that we're doing with Ms. Carney. And, we're just discussing what it was like in the earliest days of homeschooling in Maine, what's happened since then, what we can learn from that, and how that's valuable for us moving forward and protecting freedoms for homeschoolers in Maine and everywhere. So, Kathi, I think we left off maybe somewhere around 1985-ish in our last discussions. So let's kind of pick up with tell me about the general sense of relief that was felt once the school boards were out of the picture.
Well, many of the school boards had been so difficult that people were glad to have them out of the picture and only have to file their materials with the State Department of Education and get approval from the commissioner at that point. They still had to produce a whole curriculum description and many other pieces of paperwork. It's not like today where you just send in your notice of intent and that's the end of it.
Got it.
But it seemed to calm down some of that animosity amongst the school boards and in the community. So I would say the years between 1985 and 1990 were years of enormous growth of homeschooling. I remember talking with the consultant up in the Department of Education who was dealing with homeschoolers. And every year he would say, I think it's peaked.
So it was surprising to them that more and more people were coming into this movement, so to speak.
Yes, it was very surprising. And it was a pretty eclectic mix of people. There were people who were homeschooling for religious reasons. There were people who were homeschooling for academic reasons. Mm-hmm. There were people who were homeschooling because they lived really far from a school and their kids were on the bus for too long each day. There were people who were homeschooling particularly for secular reasons. All kinds of reasons for homeschooling, and it just kept growing and growing, and little groups started here and there. Although I had helped to start the first homeschool support group in the state in the Auburn area, before we knew it, especially after 1985, there were little groups all over the place.
Yeah, that's awesome. So tell me about GEM, the Guardians of Education in Maine. Who were they and what was that all about?
They were their own group. And they were a very extremely conservative group. They collected materials about education. They had connections with people like Sam Blumenfeld, who he's passed away now, was exceptionally conservative, but he did publish a book called Alpha Phonics, which is how to teach phonics to your kids. And it wasn't very expensive, so a lot of people did buy it since they can't get curriculum materials yet from either the public schools or the Christian publishers. They were able to get that book, which GEM distributed and sold at their little shop. And people could teach their kids phonics in a pretty easy to use guide. So they were looking at all aspects of education in Maine through a very, very conservative lens. And then it happened to just coalesce around the time that there became more and more homeschoolers.
Mm.
So whenever, there was legislation that affected homeschooling, somebody from that group usually showed up along with bazillions of homeschoolers from all over the state and a lot of other people. They kept a small, like a little library and bookstore at their home.
Okay.
And they were very supportive of homeschooling groups that were starting across the state, including Homeschoolers of Maine.
Hmm. Well, tell us more about that, about the start of Homeschoolers of Maine.
Oh, well, there had been another fairly large group. And it was actually, I believe it was a business rather than a nonprofit group.
Okay.
And they had sponsored a couple of conferences. They ran what we would now call an online high school. But it wasn't exactly online because people were not online at that time. They ran a high school program, and they got bigger and bigger. And Ed and Kathi Green really felt that there needed to be something out there for a homeschooling group that wasn't primarily a business, and also could help to support the growing number of Christian homeschoolers as well as secular homeschoolers. So they formed Homeschoolers of Maine. And it started small, like all groups start. And it did grow and grow and grow, but homeschooling grew and grew and grew.
Yeah.
It's, we're talking, I think 1990, maybe, when they formed it. And so you think about 35 years later or so, 37 years later, and so much change has happened, and so many more people are homeschooling now. It's much more widely accepted than it ever was before. And then, you throw the pandemic in on top of it all.
Right.
And a lot of kids who were technically public school students are at home learning. So you had tremendous growth between the time that Homeschoolers of Maine started and what we have now.
Yeah. Yeah, especially in these last 2 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people who ended up with their kids at home decided to continue to homeschool and took their kids out of public school after the pandemic online learning thing.
Yes. Yes.
I happen to really love teaching online. So my students in public school, I think, had a really good experience, and they did really well. I know that that was not the case for a lot of people.
Right. And in all fairness, the public schools really were forced into pivoting pretty quickly into a situation they were not prepared for. So online learning, when that's what you're planning on, when that's what you're prepared for, can definitely be an amazing opportunity. But I definitely see where this, that's not what it was meant to be. And then it kind of got shifted to.
They sent us home on a Tuesday in March of 2020. I had a 15-minute lesson on how to use Google Meet.
Oh my goodness.
Which is video conferencing like Zoom.
Right, because you were teaching in public at that time.
Yes. By Thursday morning, I was teaching all of my classes live online.
My goodness.
I chose to do that because I thought that my kids really needed the interaction. A lot of teachers just put work in Google Classroom, but I did it live online from the get-go. But yeah, we got no training in how to teach online.
Yeah.
We got no professional development. We got nothing except occasional tech help.
Yeah.
And so I can imagine in situations where the teacher was not teaching live online, that it would have been really hard for a lot of kids, or a lot of parents would have just picked up the slack. And I think both things happened.
Yeah. So when Homeschoolers of Maine started, did you notice any shift in the landscape of homeschooling, or any shift in other support groups, or how homeschooling was done? Just kind of what did you notice, just in a kind of general sense, about homeschooling in Maine once that resource became available?
There began to be annual conferences, homeschool conventions. And I think that having that to look forward to was really nice for people. They were able to look at curriculum in person before they purchased.
As a homeschool family, that is like highlight of our year, is the annual conference and the curriculum, and that we basically got most of our curriculum there because the kids are able to get hands-on. They're able to look at it and say, yes, mom, I love this, or no, mom, don't buy it because I won't.
Yeah.
Right? Like flat out, forget about it. You are buying a headache and a hassle that you're just gonna have to return. So yeah, and the interaction, the engagement, the support, the encouragement that we've received, each one of us, my husband, myself, and our children at the homeschool conventions, have been just foundational and priceless for our school journey.
And the kids get to be with other homeschooled kids from all over the state, which is really nice.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Are there any other things? Yeah, go ahead.
So I think that the conventions were really great. Outside speakers were brought in, as well as speakers from within the state. And a lot of resources ended up being available at those conventions, including representation from different community groups around the state that people might not have known about, some nationally known speakers. And it just, I think that the conventions really helped to kind of pull people together.
So looking more at, historically, homeschoolers in Maine showed up, you felt like there's more, it sounds like more cohesiveness in general across the homeschool population.
I think it was a little more organized. It was a little more broad-based. And the emphasis was on service and ministry rather than it being a business proposition.
Yeah.
And that, for any group, I think that just kind of puts it in a different light.
Yeah.
So that was helpful. The other thing that happened, I'm not sure that, well, ever since that rules hearing back in the early 80s, with the 4 superintendents offering to help the Department of Education, homeschoolers have been pretty suspicious of any legislation or rules that have come out. It's actually amazing. They say an elephant never forgets, that old phrase. Well, homeschoolers don't ever forget when they've been kind of threatened by legislation or the rules making process and not brought into the conversation and sort of attacked. So one of the things that came out of having wide-ranging state organization was that you could track legislation. Now, in the old days, we are talking late 80s through the 90s. So you actually had to go someplace where the bills had been printed and were available, and you had to go through them one by one on paper.
Wow. That sounds exhaustive.
Ditto for any rules out of the Department of Education or any other department. The notice would go in the newspaper, And if you were interested in a particular set of rules, you had to actually call Augusta, and they had to put a copy of the rules in the mail to you. And hopefully you got them before the hearing happened.
Wow.
Yeah, it was way easier after the internet.
Mm-hmm.
But we used to have to do it by hand, and you had to go someplace where where somebody had a subscription to the bills, and you had to sit there and look at them one by one. We still look at the bills one by one, but now it's just all online. So you do it from the comfort of your living room.
Right. And you don't have to worry about snail mail and waiting and maybe missing
none of that.
Yeah, awesome.
But because of what had happened with those rules back in '83, it really made homeschoolers of all persuasions pretty suspicious and wanting to keep an eye on things. So when Homeschoolers of Maine formed, one of the things that happened in that group was that we had a couple of people who would look at legislation, and if you saw something problematic, we would let Ed know. He was the president of the organization, and we would talk about what he might want to say if he went to a hearing. So it's just keeping an eye on things mostly. Most legislation that comes down the pike is, doesn't have anything to do with homeschoolers. Very occasionally, some legislator will get an idea and they'll put it in. That was how we ended up with the public school access law for homeschoolers.
Tell us about that.
The impetus for that law did not come from any part of the homeschooling community. It didn't come from Homeschoolers of Maine. It didn't come from other homeschool groups that were around the state. There was a big secular one down in Portland at the time. Wasn't coming from any of those areas. It came, I think, from somebody speaking to their legislator.
Okay.
And the legislator speaking to other legislators on the committee, and them coming up with this particular option.
Interesting.
I can't even remember where homeschool groups came down on it. I think there were some groups that didn't want to mess with it and some groups that did. It ended up passing. So we have the public school access law for homeschoolers. Very recently, I think within the last 3 or 4 years, the private school contingent out there in the state also went to the legislature over the same thing. And now there's an option for private school students to be able to participate in sports at the public school if their private school doesn't have a particular team.
Interesting.
So yeah, that came pretty late because the public school access law has been around for quite a while.
And is there anything you want to say about what that law dictates, for those who may not be familiar with it?
Sure. It requires public schools to allow homeschool students to take classes at the public school as long as the public school has room in the class and enough materials and textbooks. And it also allows homeschoolers to participate in extracurricular activities. The law itself is very specific as to what's required of the student, the school, and the parents. And it's very detailed. I think that the way that the law is written, it really spells out everyone's responsibilities in a very specific way. And I think that that's helpful. The other thing that happens with legislation, when you're looking at legislation, is that sometimes a legislator will put a bill in and they're not thinking at all about how it might affect homeschoolers. There was a bill that was put in a number of years ago. I caught it when I was doing this review of bills. It was really to make sure that young kids who were 16 and getting their licenses, that they were also going to school. But it was written in such a way that if you were enrolled in a public school, you could go ahead and take your driver's test and get your license. If you were homeschooled, the way the law was written would be you would have to be homeschooled for a whole year before you could do that. It's borrowed language from another state. That happens a lot. Yeah. You get borrowed language in bills that come from other states or that come from various interest groups out there, and it lands in a bill in the legislature, especially in the long session, where any legislator can put in a bill. It totally didn't fit our situation here in Maine. It was totally discriminatory against homeschoolers. It was going to cause a problem, but you were able to head it off at the pass by talking with the sponsor of the bill. Sometimes that works to talk to the sponsor. Sometimes it doesn't work. And then if you know that the bill is going to go in the hopper in the legislature, then you have to decide what's going to be an approach that will work for this.
Yeah. Well, that just really brings up the importance of having someone like Homeschoolers of Maine and others watching the legislation, and also for people building relationships with their local legislators, with their people who are in office, and knowing who they are and knowing that we can go to them and that they'll actually listen to us when we have something to say because we've built that relationship and rapport. Homeschoolers of Maine has a page all about protecting freedom, protecting homeschool freedom in particular, but freedoms in general, especially parental freedoms. And this is just another great tool to help equip people and help them understand, because when we know where we've been and what it's taken to get here and what other families have gone through, it's a lot easier to see where steps are that we can take ourselves to appreciate and to continue to fight for these freedoms that have been gained throughout the years. Is there anything else you'd like to add about that, Kathi?
It's everyone's responsibility to be taking a look at what the legislature is doing. I love a phrase from the old, I think it's from the old Noah Webster Blueback Speller, the American Spelling Book. And there's a lesson for older kids, 7th or 8th grades, and it tells how the legislature is supposed to behave in the reading for that spelling lesson. Legislators represent all of the individuals in their area. Mm-hmm. And they work for the citizens. So if you do have a concern, anyone, about any particular bill, it's a good idea to talk to your legislator about it. They're there to work for you.
Absolutely. Well, Kathi, one other thing I wanted to touch on was co-ops. These days that's kind of a common term. People join co-ops. They want to kind of outsource some of the teaching abilities of others in their community. What would you like to share with us about co-ops and kind of how they came to be?
As long as there's been homeschooling, unless you're, in a really isolated area, like Abby Burgess out on the island with the lighthouse, or Laura Ingalls, who's, traveling across America in a covered wagon. I think that homeschoolers have called on other people to help with this or that. My first experience with homeschooling with my friend in the Auburn area, she had a child who really wanted to learn more about art and art history. Mm-hmm. And she asked me to help with that and with another subject. So people have always done this. It's just now it has a name. And they're a little bit more organized, some of them, not all of them. Some of them are a little bit more organized. I do recommend, if you want to start a co-op, especially these days, there's an excellent article on the Homeschool Legal Defense Association website about legal considerations when you start a co-op, because you want to make sure that you're not going to be considered a school or a daycare.
Absolutely.
And if you're running primarily a drop-off program, you're probably going to be considered a daycare. And that's a whole different set of rules and legalities and so forth. So, but, you know, homeschooling families helping each other has been going on forever.
Yeah, I recently did an interview with Darren Jones from Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and he was speaking on just that, all the legal considerations of starting any kind of a homeschool support group. And there were things that had just never occurred to me. You know, just like with the legislators, right? We don't know what we don't know because it's completely outside of our field of knowledge or awareness. So having a conversation, reading that article from HSLDA, if you're considering starting a group of any sort, is definitely going to be really advantageous to make sure that you're not getting yourself in trouble that you didn't even know existed, right?
Exactly. And I would strongly recommend that particular article to someone who is starting a secular homeschool group co-op, as well as anyone starting one for a particular religious organization. It's just basic, important legal information. You don't want to get into any legal trouble. You don't want the kids and families to get into any legal trouble.
Yeah.
So you want to protect yourself. You want to protect the families. You want to protect the kids. And it's a really important article to read.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for mentioning that. Well, Kathi, as we wrap up, I'd love to hear you speak just briefly. We know that we are standing on the history of those who have come before us and the legislative issues, the court issues. Can you just touch briefly on a little bit of history with Peter Mills, and then separate from that, the Bangor Baptist case and Susan Blount, and just how pivotal, I know they're both, you know, we could do a whole entire webinar on just those. But if you could just kind of touch briefly on sort of what happened with those and what the impact has been on homeschooling in Maine.
I will touch upon the Bangor Baptist case. The Bangor Baptist Church case came about because in the late 70s and early 80s, in order to start a private school, you had to be an approved private school through the Department of Education.
Okay.
And for the Maine Department of Education to approve you as a private school required that you had only certified teachers teaching, that you taught the basic curriculum, and that they approved your curriculum. So in order to do this, it was like a huge amount of paperwork to put all of that data together. The Bangor Baptist Church said that it was violating their religious beliefs to get approval of their curriculum or to be required to only have state certified teachers. And so they took it to court. And ultimately, they won the case. And the judge said, no, you don't have to get your curriculum approved. You don't have to have state certified teachers. But it still left the children truant, because the children would be attending a school that wasn't approved. And the way that the law was written at the time was the compulsory attendance law said you had to go to public school or you had to go to an approved private school, or it didn't even mention homeschooling, the term in the law at that time. It just said equivalent instruction in any other manner arranged for by the school board and approved by the commissioner. So that meant the children would have been truant. So the school could have opened, but the children would have been truant. Parents would have been thrown in jail. And the judge took both sides into his chambers afterwards and said, we need to work out an agreement here so the kids won't be truant. So the agreement that came out of that is our current guidelines for non-approved, well, now they're called equivalent instruction private schools. They were then called non-approved private schools.
Okay.
And it was a series of assurances, voluntary, that word is very important, that the schools would make, that they would teach the basic subjects, that they would have 175 days of school, that they would give quarterly progress reports to the parents, that the teachers would be examined by the school directors and approve, not approve, they didn't use the word approve, basically like for competence, and that they could teach there. So they didn't have to be certified. And so those guidelines became, they've never been codified into law, and they are not rules. They are still guidelines, voluntary guidelines.
Okay.
And those are the guidelines that have the non-approved, now equivalent instruction private schools have used all those years since the early 80s. Where the Blount case fits in was Susan Blount and her family made the same argument that getting approval from the school board and the commissioner of their homeschooling program and curriculum was violating their religious beliefs. So first, she tried to just form a non-approved private school with her children. But the Maine Department of Education and the Attorney General had decided that a school was 2 or more unrelated children.
Okay.
So they said she couldn't do that. And she was religiously opposed to getting approval of her homeschool. So it went to court. It was a 5-day court extravaganza in Superior Court.
Wow.
There were several expert witnesses on both sides from out of state, and I was an expert witness from in-state. And I remember them asking me, was approval absolutely necessary in order to assure that the children were getting an education? And I said, no, she's already offered to show you her curriculum materials, to give you an annual assessment of the children, to have 175 days of school. She's doing all of this. She's just saying, please don't approve us. So if she's doing all of this, the kids are getting an education. So anyway, that case went against the family, but they continued to homeschool, and the state and locals didn't bother them again.
Interesting.
I think no one wanted to end up in court again. I really do. Susan wrote a small book about their experience. You can still, I believe, read some of the arguments in both of those cases, and you can certainly read the Bangor Baptist decision, because that's all online now.
Got it.
What's very interesting is to go back before the Bangor Baptist decision and look at news. I have a subscription to newspapers.com, which happens to have all the back issues of the Bangor Daily News back to the 1800s.
Oh,
so I
wow.
was able to actually go in and read, what the lead up to this case. And there were, many families that were saying, we will go to jail, and
Wow.
everything. So it was good that the Bangor Baptist case came out the way that it did. I think it's opened up a lot of opportunities for different kinds of private schools in the state. I'm still wondering, what was the difference between that and Susan Blount's case when she was essentially making the same argument as was made in the Bangor Baptist case. But you never know what the courts are going to do, right? So anyway, that's those pieces. Let's save Peter Mills for later.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kathi, for sharing just this rich history of your experience with homeschooling in Maine. And again, thank you for all that you have done personally, giving of your life energy, your knowledge, your skill sets to move homeschooling forward, to write the homeschool law, to have a little bit of logic and common sense woven into the mix. And ensuring that this freedom is readily accessible and available to families such as mine today. So for that, thank you. Well, for anyone interested, homeschoolersofmaine.org, you'll find a lot more information again on the Protecting Freedom movement, as well as on the annual homeschool convention and the annual Homeschool Leader Connect events. There are also curriculum sales and inventory sales, auctions, all kinds of other things there, as well as support through your local homeschool coaches and regional representatives. So just know that Homeschoolers of Maine is here to support you on your journey, wherever you are with homeschooling. And thank you again, Kathi, for being on the board for Homeschoolers of Maine and for all that you've done. Have a great day.